last year at the Mind Your Own Business conference down in Atlanta, put on by Blair Enns and David C. Baker, I had the opportunity to speak to the man we're going to talk to now. And, what's ordinary to him was amazing to me. We've kept in touch since. And today, Dr. Adrian McIntyre is here to talk to us about the art of the anecdote. But, Adrian, first of all, welcome. Thrilled to have you here.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
And then, next, can you share a little bit about your background? Because I think understanding that gives the perspective of where we're going here.
Yeah, and I should give our listeners and viewers advance warning. The most boring part of most interviews is when the guest says, "Tell us about yourself," and then the person goes on and on and on and on. I want to share with you, before I tell you the actual story, the point that I've come to over the years, which is that as human beings, we connect with each other through language and story. We do that intuitively. You don't need a consultant or an expert to tell you how to do it. You do it every day. But what we don't always know how to do is tap into the unique parts of our own experience in ways that make a real connection with other people. And I hope that's what we're going to get to today. And I want to tell you how I got there, right? Because I probably, when you hear the details of my background, I should have figured this out a long time ago. That's the punchline of the story. I grew up literally in a radio station. My dad owned the radio station, and as a little kid, I was always in the station, and I would sleep in a little bed on the floor behind the turntables in Studio A, and would hang around with my dad as he was growing this thing. And when I was 5 years old, he got the idea that our family should start producing a children's radio show that would also go on our station. So we had a home recording studio. This is 1978. And every week, my mom and dad and me and my little sister would sit around and do the script that my dad would later edit into the program. And the Happy Day Express became the longest running children's radio show in California history. And it was all stories and music and connecting with the audience. And we didn't call it, content marketing at the time. We didn't have the phrase personal brand to describe what we were doing. But that's really what happened. Our family sort of became known as the McIntyres and the voices on the Happy Day Express and things of that nature. Now, truth is, that was cool when I was 5, 6, 7, 8, and it was a lot less cool when I was 25, 26, 27, 28, and those episodes from the past were still playing every Friday night on the station. We did 3 years of episodes, and then they just played in reruns, forever. And I never really thought much about what we had been doing. I never really thought about what it meant to have a message and a microphone and connect with an audience. It was just sort of like, this is my life. This is what's happening. I took it all for granted. In college, after dropping out twice, that's a whole other story, living all over the world, kind of coming back and finding the academic field of anthropology, and realizing, hey, I don't have any clue what I actually want to do with my life, but anthropologists get to talk about all kinds of cool stuff like history and culture and language and people. I like those things. Maybe I could be an anthropologist. So again, I'm now in a professional discipline that's focused on the intersection of language and identity, how we talk to ourselves about ourselves, how groups of us see ourselves as unique and different, and how our stories from the past kind of give us who we are in the present, right? Help us make sense of the world, help us find meaning and significance, and definitely communicate that we're different from those people, right? There's all this stuff that plays out. But still, this is an academic exercise for me. I think it's interesting. I'm learning languages. I'm living other places. I'm talking to people whose experience is very different than mine. But I still kind of take it all for granted. I mean, again, it's an academic exercise. It's research, right? I never looked at my own life through the lens of storytelling and connection, right? I just did. It's literally like, and I now say this in keynote speeches that I give, it's like a fish in water. Fish never see water. Humans are like that with story. We live our entire life in language, but we don't see language. We don't see story. What we see is a function of the stories we're already telling. but I don't know that. Like, I know it like as a concept and a set of theories, and the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis of linguistic relativity, which says fundamentally and profoundly that our words create our world, not the other way around. But that's something that you study and write papers about. It's not something that you live, or didn't anyway. So fast forward now 20 years ago, the year's 2004. I'm living in Nairobi. I've been working for an international relief organization in conflict areas, doing humanitarian aid. And I was always the media communication storytelling guy. In fact, I even have a contract. Before storytelling was cool, I got hired to be a storyteller. Like, that was the assignment, right? Go out there and talk about the people, talk about the programs, talk about the work. And this was all in the context of nonprofit, raising awareness about conflict, raising money, et cetera, et cetera. But I take storytelling for granted. I'm like, sure, I'll go find people, I'll talk to them, we'll report on them, whatever. And I had done a lot of media work at this point because, again, it just came naturally to me. I didn't think twice about it. Like, it was intuitive. Like you said, Tom, in the intro, what's extraordinary to other people was totally ordinary to me. One day I would be standing in the middle of some, refugee camp in the farthest reaches of Darfur, and BBC World would be interviewing me live via satellite phone. Adrian McIntyre, tell us what's going on, But like you'll hear from a lot of journalists and aid workers and others who have worked in war zones, there's a way in which what was actually happening was sort of detached from me. I didn't let it in. And you kind of can't, because it gets a little overwhelming, especially in the middle of a crisis like Darfur, where there's millions and millions of people who've been displaced. There's brutal violence happening everywhere. The government of the country you're in doesn't want you to talk about it because they're involved in it. And it gets messy. Anyway, I'm in Nairobi and we have a job. There's a group of experts from, they're all African nationals of different countries who have been working for nonprofit aid agencies like ours, or for the UN. And these people need to prepare to speak in a very historic moment. The United Nations Security Council is for only the second time in its history meeting formally outside of New York, where they normally meet. They are meeting in Nairobi. And what's on the table is a way to end the longest running civil war in Africa, which is the conflict in Sudan, separate from Darfur, but connected. We won't get into that. And this group of African professionals has an opportunity to speak directly to the United Nations Security Council. So they brought in a bunch of us communications advisors from different agencies and said, work with these folks and help them get ready to do this. This is a big deal. So we had a day blocked out, and I and several colleagues were meeting with these folks, and they were our peers, right? We were employed by the same agencies. Our contracts were written in Oxford or Brussels or wherever. Their contracts were written in Nairobi, but we were essentially peers. In the aid world, is national staff and international staff, which is a dumb and probably racist division, but because we work together, we do the same stuff. And they start presenting the speeches that they've been working on. And I'm listening to them, and these are brilliant people. They're deeply experienced people. They know the local context, and they're speaking this very dehumanized language of international policy. And it's not landing at all. And it's the same language that I would speak when I'm writing an internal report to my agency or whatever, but it's just not interesting. It's not compelling. And I realize we have somehow created this hierarchy of value that you have to talk like that in order to be seen as a professional. And as the day, and I wasn't the only one with this insight. I mean, it was all of us kind of struggling with like, man, how do we get this to land? So we told everybody, listen, just take the speech you prepared and set it aside, and let's just talk. Tell me your story. Why do you care about this, right? What's going on in your actual life? Tell me about your family, right? And they started to speak with such passion, such humanity, such depth of emotion about why ending conflict in this part of Africa was essential. And they stopped being representatives of international organizations, speaking the very bureaucratic language of international affairs, and they started being mothers, tribal leaders, children who had witnessed, horrific acts of violence and grown into adults who are now trying to do something about it. They spoke as engineers. They spoke as community organizers, right? All the aspects of their humanity came out. And I'm just so moved even thinking about it now, because we didn't do something to make them better communicators, except remove the artificial language that we had sort of imposed in the first place, like collectively over the years of the way we worked. And that's when I started to realize, wait a minute, everybody has humanity embedded in their experience, right? What connects us is not the things that we have in common. What connects us is actually the differences that remind us of our shared humanity. So rather than getting everyone to talk the same, we need to have people talk different. And in those differences, we'll hear what we have in common. All right. Now, Adrian is off on like a soapbox right now in this moment. But I want to tell you, that was the first time when I began to realize, okay, there's an unlock that has to happen. We actually have to unlearn some of the ways we've been told we have to show up, right? And we have to start tapping into the unique and messy, but ultimately beautiful humanity that we all walk around with. And I thought, okay, I got to do something with this insight. I got to find a way to channel. I started to see my own past differently. And I'm like, I've been taking all this stuff for granted. That's a function of my own privilege. It's a function of, I have a passport that allows me to move across borders. These people don't. I was born into a very comfortable white suburban neighborhood in Southern California. These people have lived in extremely different circumstances. Why don't I explore that more? And I started to see the way in which I had taken so much about language and culture and story for granted, and I wanted to do it differently. And that's the beginning of the journey that led us to talk today.
Yeah. And as you were talking about that, there were so many points there. I mean, the idea of the anecdote, right? It's a short, amusing, or interesting story, but one with a point. And you had that. That's the point to the story. And the other thing that really struck me as I was listening to that, Adrian, is this idea of the corporate speak, the expert speak. Do you sound like every other talking head when you go out there and being totally unmemorable, right? Being safe, connecting with no one, trying to turn off no one. And there's so much where it's like, I just look at it as marketing supposed to be magnetic, right? Attract the right people, repel the wrong people. So being authentic, being human will help that speed of the story to people to self-identify that, like, yes, Adrian, and the speed of story of the people that I want to work with, or no, he's not for me. Fine. Either way, it is fine there. But, it's that you want to be memorable.
Well, you said something, and I love that memorable thing, because I think we get really confused about this. We want to fit in, but we want to be memorable. You can't. We always like, well, I want to stay top of mind, right? That's my marketing, top of mind. You can't, because you weren't memorable to begin with, right? You didn't realize, and I don't mean, let your freak flag fly when it's inappropriate. When it is appropriate, by all means, go for it, right? But I mean, find ways to connect with others. And this is what led me, Tom, to a paradox that I want to share with you and everyone, which is our stories are probably the greatest untapped asset that we have in our lives and in our businesses, right? And maybe we know that. But what we may not think about is the fact that nobody actually wants to hear them. There's this started a few years ago. Storytelling became such a buzzword, and there were all kinds of self-appointed storytelling experts telling folks, share your story. The world wants to hear it. And the only thing I could think of is, no, they don't. Listen, you have been gracious enough, if you're still listening, that you let me talk about myself for like 8 minutes, or I don't know, maybe it was longer. That's a long chunk of time. But we have a little bit more permission in this context to go in depth, mostly unless you're speaking on stage, giving a keynote. And even then, you maybe get 15 minutes of your 45 to kind of tell your story. So here's the paradox. what actually connects us powerfully to other people is when we can share personal anecdotes that aren't about us. And let me say what I mean, because it sounds like, wait a minute. It's like Zeno's paradox. What's the sound of one hand clapping, whatever, all those kind of statements that make no sense. I realize one is Zen and one is Greek. Personal stories, personal anecdotes that aren't about you. So here's what I mean. Sharing personal anecdotes, short, much shorter than what I just did, and we can talk about examples of that, that aren't about you. In other words, your unique circumstances are not shared by others. There may be people who listen to that who have never been in any of the places I'm talking about, have never been on the radio, have never done any of the things, right? So those aren't the details that are going to connect us. But this idea of taking people for granted and not seeing who they really are, sort of assuming that the surface is the story, maybe somebody could listen to that and go, oh, actually I do that. Never really thought about it. I could get more curious. I could actually take people's humanity more seriously. I could get interested in what's underneath. So when a story isn't about us, what's it about? It's about the human condition. It's about something we have in common, even though the surface level differences would seem to separate us. That's what I mean. Telling personal stories that aren't about you is a way for other people to connect with their own humanity because they heard your story.
And to learn from your story. And, when you said nobody cares about your story, I pushed back a little bit because I think that's an interesting story, but there has to be a point to it. It's got to be, right. How does this apply to me? And I see a lot of people on podcast interviews, on stages, different places, they're going on with the story and they lose people, right? And it may be short, it may be amusing, it may be interesting, but there's no point to it. So how do you look at that as far sort of starting with the end in mind?
Right. Well, the first thing I tell folks is I'll let you in on a secret that all great storytellers know, and we've kept this secret sacred, but I will now share it with you. And that is that every powerful story has the exact same structure. There are three key features of every great story, and I'll tell you what they are. You ready? It has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, I'm just playing with people when I do this, right? But because the interesting thing is not that. The interesting thing is, well, what goes at the beginning, what goes in the middle, and what goes at the end? If all stories have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, how do you begin to think about them? So beginning with that end in mind, as you said, is a great place to start. It's not the only place to start. You can actually work this problem from either end. What's the lesson that I want to share? And then where in my life is there a situation, a moment, an encounter, something happened that illustrates that lesson? So you can kind of choose the lesson and then find the example. Or you can think about a moment in your life, and we have a whole process of helping people get to this. Side note, people aren't walking around with a full archive of personal stories ready to share. People are often walking around with a couple of things they think are their story. And I often say that's because there's so much of our lives we can't remember because there's a few things we can't forget. We sort of get stuck with our stories. And we think our life is defined by these couple key moments, often very upsetting, difficult, or traumatic. And we think that's our story and that's who we are. One of the things people find when they work with us is, oh, there's so many things that are actually available to me that, I would be willing to share. A lot of times people don't want to share the big hurt. And I understand that. That's appropriate. Sometimes we're not ready, or sometimes the audience doesn't deserve the gift of that wisdom and insight, right? It's not a fit. You don't have to bare your soul to the world to make a profound impact and difference with people. Anyway, I digress. So you can get the lesson and then find the happening, the moment, the day when, or you can start from the other side and kind of create an inventory of events, right? And I want to draw another distinction here that I hope will be really helpful for people. When we talk about the anecdote, I want to what I shared with you was not so much an anecdote. It was really a kind of a, this is Adrian's life history. Like I started when I was 5 and ended 20 years ago, and implied that it connects to the work I do today. So that was like the arc of all of it, right? That's not an anecdote. That's a signature story. That's kind of a, when you have permission to tell a version of your thing, that's the thing. An anecdote is like a small s story, not a big S one, right? It's a moment in time. It's a place. There were people there. It happened on a day, not a decade, right? So you want to look at the level of, where was I when? Because that's by the way, to the 3 parts. I'm being a little messy with my metaphors and structures here. Sorry about that. But the beginning of an anecdote is literally just that. Stories always happen somewhere, some when, to someone or someone's. So how you start an anecdote is like this. When I was in the 2nd grade, the teacher called a meeting with my parents, and we all went into the office, and the principal was there. And the teacher said, I just want you to know that I'm actually worried about Adrian. I don't think he's going to be happy in my class. He seems to be so far ahead in reading. I like to read. Than all the other kids. I think maybe he should be in the 3rd grade. Now, there's a whole point to the story. I don't want to tell the whole story right now, but that's the beginning of it, right? I was this age at this place at this time, and now you have a little context. That's how stories start. The middle, what's between the lesson and kind of the scene, the middle has to be tension, conflict. Something happened. There was an obstacle, there was a breakdown, there was a challenge, there was a dilemma. Something changed or demanded you to change. You had to deal with it, you had to get over it, etc., right? In my little story about the 2nd grade, what happened was I didn't want to go into the 3rd grade, but my mom thought it was great that little Adrian is so smart and all her friends will know that he got promoted to the next grade 3 weeks into the 2nd grade school year. So they made me do it. And when I walked into the 3rd grade classroom for my first day of 3rd grade, 3 weeks into that year, I got confronted at the door by a kid much bigger than me, who accosted me, shoved me against the wall, said, "Who are you? What are you doing here? You don't belong here." Right? And I knew he was right. I don't want to be here. I don't belong here. This is terrible. Like, people are making me do things that I don't want to do. I have no say in my life. Now, I wasn't thinking it like in that language. That's an adult's version. But in that moment, I knew this is all wrong and I don't belong. Okay? So that's a moment of tension. That's a moment of conflict. And what actually happened was I shut down and I stopped doing schoolwork. Oh, if being the smart kid makes people put you in situations where you get bullied, then I don't want any part of it. And I stopped doing homework. From the 3rd grade until the 2nd time I dropped out of college, I was a terrible student. I got Fs. It was a small private school, and they just kept moving me to the next year because Adrian's a good kid, and we know he's not really causing any trouble. But there was something that had to get resolved, right? So that crisis, that dilemma, that challenge, that's the middle. Every great story has something in the middle that makes people stop. They're confronted. They have to rethink things. There's a breakdown, right? And then the end is always the lesson, the outcome, the insight. It took me many, many years to realize that the kind of assault of a 3rd grade bully doesn't define who I am. That I can actually show up anywhere and be myself, whether I've been invited or not. It's okay. I'm okay. There's nothing wrong, right? This world is just as much my birthright as anybody else's. And I can keep an eye out for the people who might have also been bullied, might have also been rejected, might have also been kept out of things. I can use my privilege to look for ways to help people who don't have it. I can find ways to be an ally. I'm going to be the guy who doesn't let the bully do the thing, right? But it took me years to realize that. I had to somehow get out of that world.
To back up, the end of that story started when you said, and then I realized years later. That is the end of the story. And that was the point to it. If you just left it hanging there, it's like interesting, but why? Right? There's what's the point is the end of the story there.
And there's another way I share that story sometimes. So I'm kind of doing a little meta thing here. But there's another way I share that story, or others like it sometimes, where I actually get really direct. And I will say to the audience, I don't know who your Tyson was. That was the kid's name. I don't know who in your life or what group of people in your life told you don't belong. I don't know when you decided that they were right. But what I do know is that you can undecide that. What they said to you then doesn't have to define who you are now. Right? So I turn it into a very direct, especially if I'm speaking to like young adults, I'm going to want them to know, like, what happened to you in the 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, whatever, which is a lot less time has passed for them than for me. I'm 50, so this is getting on now. I want to turn it into sometimes I want to turn it into a very direct point. Now, in a business context, that's not always what we're trying to do. If I'm doing transformational storytelling, I want someone to kind of realize an insight about themselves, then I might go there. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. The other thing that you mentioned in there is that this is the story you're telling now, not that you would have been telling as a 2nd, then a 3rd grader. So how about talking about, I've heard it referred to, about your wounds versus your scars? I see some people telling stories about things that may be so fresh that they haven't thought them through. They haven't had the perspective on that. What is your sense on that in telling anecdotes? Do they have to have time to percolate?
I don't know if they have to, but I think you do have to ask yourself that question. Like, and I alluded to this earlier. Am I ready to share this? Have I healed from the pain that's embedded in this story? Years ago, I met another keynote speaker who had been speaking on stages to youth audiences for years with a suicide prevention talk. And the crux of her talk was her own younger sister's suicide. And she shared that, and she had been sharing it week in and week out. She spoke 40, 50 times a year. I mean, that's full-time work. And what she shared with me privately was there got to be a point where she realized she didn't want to talk about her sister's death anymore. She thought she had to, right? Because there had been so much pain and she wanted to do something and she wanted to help. So she just sort of plunged into this world. And then even after having told the story so many times, which is slightly different than what you were asking me, she ended up at a place where she's like, I don't want this to be my story. This happened. This is always going to be a part of me. I changed in ways, some for the better, some for the worse. But now actually I want to tell a different story. Again, this is kind of on the epic side of things rather than the sort of the everyday anecdotes. It's not like you would share that in a networking event or necessarily on a podcast interview, although long form conversations do give you a lot of room to do some of that deeper storytelling, but it's not always a fit.
Yeah. And I think the other thing too is the medium. It's one thing to say it one-to-one to someone, but to say it on a recorded message. The reason I asked that is we had a client years ago. She was going through a bitter divorce, and she started to talk about the wounds, not the scars. And there was a couple of interviews that got so passionate, if you will, that the host wasn't comfortable in releasing them. And then go forward a couple of years, she came back and she listened to some of the interviews she did, and she's like, yeah, I don't want that content out there anymore. That's not how I view the world or the situation. So she was talking out of pain as opposed to wisdom in there. And
yeah, that's a very good distinction. I like that a lot. And I think we should all be cultivating something that gives us a little bit of discernment, I think is the word I'm looking for here. And it comes from listening, not from talking. I often say in communication trainings or when I'm working with a private client, you got to understand that maybe you came to me because you want to become a better talker, right? And that's what sales training is. That's what public speaking training is. That's what podcast guest mastery training is, right? People imagine that what I need to do is get better at the outward talking or writing part of communication, right? So they want frameworks, they want scripts, they want tips and tricks and whatever. And we have those things, but that's not what's going to make the difference. Listening is the primary skill in communication. What you say is a function of what you're hearing, right? And you can listen. One of my favorite books is Let Your Life Speak by Parker Palmer. Man, it's a great book. I have it right over there. But Parker J. Palmer, I think it is. It's either Parker J. Palmer or Palmer J. Parker. Sorry, man. But the book is Let Your Life Speak, and it's wonderful because he writes about ways to listen to your experience and the lessons that are embedded in it, and then let that guide your actions and your speaking, right? As well as, of course, the obvious thing is listening to other people. What does the world need from me? What does the world want to hear from me? And so beginning to master the art of deep listening, which is different than what everybody says about active listening, which is mostly BS. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but if you think about it, it's immediately obvious. Like people say, what is active listening? Well, it's maintaining eye contact. Okay, that's a staring contest. That's not listening, right? Well, it's making these like body movements that sort of show that you're engaged. Okay, but that's body movements. That's not listening, right? Well, what about, the sort of nonverbal communication? Mm-hmm. Oh, uh-huh, right? That's grunting. That's not listening. So you put all these things together and you could do them and still not listen, right? Listening's an inside job. It takes intention, right? The intent, you have to intend to listen, and it takes attention. You have to be connected with the speaker and then able to discern elements of their experience behind the words. I was talking to a guy just the other night. I was at an event here in Phoenix, very successful business owner hosting this event. And he had shared just kind of casually, it's clear he says this often, it sort of just rolled off the tongue, that he moved here to Phoenix at a critical moment in his life when he had become the single parent to his 3 boys, who at the time were 1-year-old, 5 years old, and 7 years old. And immediately, when you're tuned into the human experience, you got to imagine, now you don't know the details, right? But to get sole custody of your kids, including a 1-year-old, means there's some serious stuff going on. There's a lot of potential unhappiness and difficulty that were embedded in that moment. I didn't ask him about it directly after. It wasn't appropriate given the environment. But I know if we ever meet again, and if there's an opportunity for us to really connect, I'll say to him, you shared that little piece of your story, and I can just hear a world behind that. Are you willing to share a little bit more? What was going on for you when that happened? Right? So that's the curiosity that I was talking about earlier. I didn't used to be like that. I didn't actually think there was more to people than what I could perceive on the surface. But that's the practice. What can we get to that's deeper than what's obvious? And I think that's fun. I mean, I just love spending my time doing it. And I want to make sure we pivot a little bit here to a business context, because there's some definite things that folks should be taking away, or even from the world of podcast guest marketing. Like, how do you show up on a podcast? You show up to talk, which I've been doing a lot of. But how do you do that, right? So is that something you're willing to?
Oh, very much so. Like what you had talked about there is intentional, right? I think anecdotes are so powerful, short, amusing, interesting, and to the point. What is the point of this? Why are you here on the interview? So I would love to land the plane a little bit and talk about how you can do this to be a better podcast guest and really get better results from your appearances.
Absolutely. So I think it starts with something we had alluded to earlier in the conversation, which is that for most people, the harsh truth is your expertise is not sufficient to differentiate you from others.
Agreed. Yeah.
The very same things that make you qualified to do the work you do are the same things that every one of your competitors is qualified to do. You can't differentiate yourself at the level of your service or your products necessarily. Sometimes products have cool things that nobody else has. But, take any professional, for example. The letters she has after her name are the same letters that her competition has after their names, and her prospects don't know what any of them mean or why they should care, right? Your degrees, your certifications, all the things. So we have to find ways to be memorable. You used the word first here in this conversation. It's one of my favorite words, because fundamentally what we're working against is the 2 most crippling forces that will stifle the growth of your business or will prevent you from sharing your expertise. Let's say you're an academic scholar and you're wanting to do podcasts because you have specific research and insights and things that could help people understand things better. You have to overcome the two same barriers as everybody else, which is the first is invisibility. Nobody knows you exist. Anonymity is another way to say that. And the second one is incoherence. People don't get it. They don't understand what you're talking about. They don't understand who you are or what you do. Maybe you listening or watching this right now are like, okay, so he's an anthropologist and he's spent his life on microphones, but like, I still don't really get what he does. Fair enough, right? We all have to deal with this. So how you do it is by thinking about what aspects of your experience can be paired with your expertise so that you're able to couch your insights, your point of view, in your perspective, in the specific aspects of your personal life that shape the way you see what you're talking about, right? So this whole entire thing, I didn't come to it from I'm a storytelling expert who has, I came from it from my point of view, which is I grew up in a radio station. That's not common. And I'm trained in anthropology, Berkeley PhD, also uncommon. But those things didn't help me understand what I'm now trying to communicate to you. I had to figure it out, right? So now you have a context for the knowledge that I want to share. And you can do that too. So I often talk about preparation, even though I'm very much like a kind of a wing it kind of a person. Like, again, and having been so comfortable over the years, like if you called me today and were like, hey, I need you on a plane in 3 hours to fly all night to deliver a keynote to 15,000 people on a topic you've never spoken about before, I'm pumped. I'm like, this is what I do. This is going to be great and I'm going to love it and it's going to be awesome. But that's my unique ability. Like that's my personal genius, if you will. So everyone has that. How do you prepare? This is where it really starts. So I like to talk about something I call the ABBCs. The ABBCs. When you're preparing for anything, a networking event, a podcast guest appearance, a speech, even content creation, a LinkedIn video you want to make, you should be thinking about the ABBCs. And those are the anecdotes, the bullet points, the bridges, and your call to action. Right? You've talked a lot on this series and everywhere else in your book, the importance of the call to action. But have a plan for this. What anecdotes could I share? What small stories that illustrate bigger points could I weave into this communication? What are the specific concrete examples of things that I'm talking about that will carry a lesson? See, here's the thing. The story, the anecdote, that's not the point. It's the vehicle for the point. The story is not the point, it's the vehicle for the point. So have several of these in your back pocket ready to go. And it helps if you've done a bit of this kind of story inventory or archaeology, as sometimes call it, digging through the layers to find the nuggets that you want to share. We have a whole process for helping people do that, but it's something anybody can do. Like I said, you don't need a storytelling consultant to help you understand your own life. It sometimes helps because we will hear things and then ask you follow-up questions and you'll get to places you wouldn't necessarily have gone on your own. So that's anecdotes, right? Have a couple of those figured out. Bullet points. I was trained by some really amazing media spokespeople when I worked for some really large aid agencies and did these interviews, live with millions of people. And one of the best things that they said is you should have 3 talking points, no more, no less, and you should repeat them often. So your bullet points, I need the alliteration, so I call them bullet points instead of talking points. But these, you should have them and you should repeat them as often as necessary. So in this case, it's something like your story is the greatest untapped asset you have, but you don't know what to do with it and nobody wants to hear it. Right? That's one of my talking points that I'll repeat over and over, and I have others. So know your bullet points. Now your bridges, A, B, B, C, anecdotes, bullet points, bridges. This is mostly for interviews rather than for other kinds of speech performance, because you're going to be asked questions. And sometimes those questions are going to be about things you didn't prepare for or you didn't think about. Bridges are how you get from anything you're asked to one of your anecdotes or bullet points. You can actually think about this and kind of mock it and model it with somebody. You can get coaching about this. Like oftentimes when I was speaking about Darfur, for example, the media wanted to ask very direct questions, right? Joining us now live, Adrian McIntyre. Adrian McIntyre, you're in Darfur. Tell us, is Darfur a genocide? Well, we have a point of view about that as an aid agency, but we are also at the mercy of the government that's allowing us to be there helping hundreds of thousands of people. So I can't say what we actually think or we get kicked out of the country. That happened, by the way. A year after I left, the organization I was working for actually got their permit to, and we were literally supporting 500,000 people with clean water and sanitation. Children died from entirely preventable diseases like cholera or even just a case of diarrhea because we got kicked out because the government didn't like some of the things we said. Like, it's serious stuff. Well, I can't say the answer to that. So I have to bridge from the question to something else, right? So in that case, just to carry through the example, it was, that's exactly the question that legal experts are debating every day. That's not what we do. What I can tell you is this. I just got back from a camp where, and then I will tell a very vivid picture of what I'm seeing on the ground. So I can't answer the question, but I can't blow it off either. I have to bridge, right? So think about that for yourself. What are some things you might get asked? And how could you get from one of those questions to one of your bullet points or one of your stories, one of your anecdotes? And then the call to action, of course, is very obvious. What do you want people to do, right? What's the thing they can take action on? I think people forget the action part of call to action, right? It's about, you want your audience to do something. Maybe it's just, and it doesn't have to be that they like put in their email address and download your thing. Right? When you ask me at the end of this, where do you want people to go? I'm not going to tell you a thing where you go and you put your email address and you download a thing, because I'm a talker, not a writer. I don't have a thing for you to download. I have something else. So maybe you want them to think differently. Maybe you want them to take some action in their own life, right? Maybe you want them to connect with you on LinkedIn, right? Or any of the sort of obvious things that we say. But think about your call to action. What is it that you want people to do? And then how are you going to say that when you get the opportunity to do that?
Well, Adrian,
anecdotes, bullets, bridges, call to action, ABBCs.
I was going to say, we could do an entire episode on the bullets, one for the bridges and one's for the call to action. But as I said at the beginning, what's ordinary to you is amazing to others. And thank you for being here, for sharing your wisdom. Let's get to the call to action, right? Because you have given so much value here, but the idea that you're going to learn everything you can from this man in this short period of time, he's a great communicator, but there's more. So what is that more? What do you want people to do to take action on this?
Thank you. And again, I'm a bit different than folks because I am a verbal communicator. In fact, our communications firm is premised on the idea that conversation is the core skill that underlies marketing, underlies business development or sales, underlies the way we connect with people and build relationships. So my invitation is to have a conversation. If there's things that you heard me say and you think this might be relevant for you, send me a message. Go to speedofstory.com. There's a way for you can either schedule time to talk to me or just communicate through the message form. It says message Adrian right on the thing. And this may not apply to everybody. You may not want to talk. Totally get it. But if you feel like, hey, I've got some things in my life or in my business that I could communicate more powerfully to the world, that could help me be more relevant, grow my reputation, build relationships that might drive business results. That's what we do. And I invite you to have a conversation with me. So go to speedofstory.com. You'll also see the social things on there if you want to connect with me. I'm most active on LinkedIn these days. Twitter's kind of, its own dumpster fire right now, but you can follow me on any of the things. The links are all there. But connect with me on LinkedIn or send me a message, schedule a time to talk. I love conversations, and I would love to help you explore, no strings attached, whether or not this kind of storytelling would be helpful to you.
Highly encourage it. Every time I hear you speak or talk with you, I learn more. So go to Speed of Story and check out and connect with Adrian there.
You're very kind. Thank you so much.